Welcome to Rock City Cookies, where we talk about all things cookies. If you're new to the channel, hit that subscribe button and click the bell icon to be notified when we upload a new video. Thanks for watching. Hey sweet friends, Sonic 2 is in theaters right now, which means that there will be a lot more Sonic themed birthday parties over the summer. So I thought I would show you how I made a Sonic set for Zach's 5th birthday. There are 5 designs in this set, but let's get started with the most popular character, Sonic the Hedgehog. Now, everybody has a process flow that works for them, but for me, if I'm doing characters, I 100% of the time start with their eyes. The reason for this is because I firmly believe that the character's eyes are the most important part of the design. So I always start with it because, again, it's the most important element, and I build out the character from the eyes. So you can do what you think works best, but I do recommend that you always start with the character's eye pupils first, then the whites of the eyes, and then work out from there. So that is what you saw me do. I outlined the green portion of his eye, and while that was still wet, I went back with a thin black icing to do the black part of his pupil, and then I finished it up with a little white dot on the eye just to give it that little sparkle in the character's eye. While my projector is still on, I'm going to go ahead and outline the white portion of Sonic's eyes just so that I can turn off my projector. And once the green part of his eyes have dried, which does not take very long, then I'm able to go back with my white icing and fill that in without having to turn on and off my projector. When filling in the white part of his eye, you do want to make sure that you don't overfill this area, because if you do, then you'll lose the actual green eye itself. So I make sure that I have just enough icing where it does flow up to the green part of his eye, but that it doesn't overwhelm the green part of his eye and overflow that part where you can't even see it anymore. So just make sure you go slow, and you definitely will need to use your scribe tool or your toothpick or whatever you're using to get out any air bubbles, because you don't want this place to collapse on you right in the middle of your cookie. All right, so while I'm working on outlining his ear and his mouth with our beige tan icing, I did want to mention that you probably are noticing that my image and my cookie cutter are not lining up. The cookie cutter that I used was just an outline of Sonic's face, and I needed an image. So I just Google searched an image and I found one, and I put it on our cookie here. So you can see that it doesn't line up perfectly, but I'm able to manipulate my cookie with the image enough that I think I'm able to keep the aspect ratios of Sonic's face correct, even though the image doesn't line up exactly. Now, in the description box below, I did find a cookie cutter that includes an image with it, so you won't have this problem. So don't worry about that. If you click on the link, you'll take it to a cookie cutter that has a Sonic image and it's not just the outline. However, if you ever do buy a cookie cutter that is just an outline and it doesn't have an image with it, feel free to do what I did and just Google an image, try to find one as close as you can to the cookie cutter that you have purchased, and just move it in and out, zoom it in and out with your projector until you find the right fit for you. All right, now that I've explained why my cookie does not match my cookie image that you keep seeing being projected on there, I do want to mention how important it is with characters to let your icing dry between each stage. Every section needs to stand on its own. That is what gives your character depth. That is what makes it look like an actual cartoon character. Do not think, oh, I'm just going to do one large section of icing, because then you lose a lot of those details. So even though the whole rest of this cookie is going to be blue, I divided it into sections, and I'm doing each section on its own, and then I'm letting the cookie dry for a little bit before I move on to the next section. And because you are working in small icing increments, it will dry pretty quickly. So you're not waiting for your cookie to dry for hours on end before you move to the next step. Now, right here, I am doing 4 steps at one time without letting the other steps dry. And that's because none of this icing is touching one another. The eye icing, the ear Now 2 of his hair pieces, I don't know what those are called, but his hair, all of those sections aren't touching, so I'm able to do those at one time. But after that, I will be stopping this cookie, I will be placing it under my fan, I will let it dry for a few minutes, and then I'll come back to it and do more sections. And after you do your icing, every section, grab that scribe tool, get those air bubbles out, and smooth out your icing while you're at it. I prefer icing that's not too thick, but a little bit on the thicker side so that I can get a nice puffy icing. I feel like when you have a puff to your icing, it doesn't make your cookie look quite as flat. So I do have to a lot of times use the scribe tool to smooth out my icing as well. It doesn't just automatically smooth. If it does automatically smooth, then for me, that means my icing's just a little bit too thin. But again, this is 100% a preference thing. I know cookiers who make incredibly beautiful cookies, and their cookies are with thin icing, like really thin icing. So this is just a preference thing. I think after you do enough cookies, you really do tend to get in a rhythm, into a groove, and you just tend to prefer one way over another. So this is just my preference, but find your groove, and there is nothing wrong with that. All right, so I did Sonic's second ear, and now I'm doing the final element of his hair. So again, I'm smoothing it out, and then I will move on to the last section that we will flood with blue, which is the top of Sonic's head. Now I do outline all of these sections first before I flood them. It just keeps your icing in place. It makes sure that you know exactly where you're gonna go with your icing. So here, the only part I had to outline was the very top edge of the cookie to make sure the icing didn't spill over, but you do really want to make sure that you outline and then flood first. Because you can't see what bags I'm using for the icing and all the bags look exactly the same in these videos, I always get asked if I'm using the same icing to outline and then flood. And the answer is no, no, no. I never use the same consistency icing to outline and flood. So I use a thick consistency to do all of my outline work and my detail work, and then I use a thin consistency to flood. So I have 2 icing bags of every single color. I have a thick icing and a flood consistency icing. And now I actually am using that same consistency icing that I used to outline. It's what I use for my details as well. So it's what I am using for Sonic's eyebrow here. Okay, let's finish up our Sonic character with a nose and a mouth. So with a medium consistency icing, let's put a little nose at the end of his mouth. Let's give a little white dot right at the tip to kind of help with that character look, that cartoon character look. And then we'll finish him up with a half smile with, again, a thick consistency tan icing. Okay, see, that wasn't so hard at all. Our Sonic character cookie is done. Let's move on to the golden ring cookie. Okay, to start, let's talk about how I got this design. I ended up using the circle cookie cutters that I have. I did not buy a special cookie cutter to make this golden ring cookie. I used the circle cookie cutters that I already own, which I do have linked in the description box below. They are from Amazon. And these cookie cutters from Amazon are a group of circle cookie cutters. So they all come in one little tin. They all nest within each other, but they have a very small size up to a pretty decent sized circle. So I love them because they fit any project that I could possibly need a circle for. I'm going to find the right size because I have so many varying sizes of them. I highly recommend, love them. So what I did here is I took a large circle cookie cutter first. I took about the one that's about 3.5 inches across. And then I took a smaller cookie cutter. So I took the one that was probably about 2 inches across, and that left me about 1.5 inches of a ring of dough. So you can kind of mess with your sizes before you actually do any cuts and see which ratio you like the best. But that's kind of what I found, is I wanted a thinner ring, but you don't want too thin of a ring because this cookie is going to be fragile because it doesn't have a lot of stability since you took out the middle. So make sure you keep that in mind. You don't want too thin of a ring or else your cookie might break. But that's about what I did, was about a 3.5 inch cookie across, and then I used the cookie cutter that was about 2 inches across to cut out the middle. So you saw me outline and flood the cookie, and then of course I let it dry. And I did that in the tails color that I'm going to be using later. However, I do tend to prefer to use a color as close to gold as I can get. So I either use oranges or yellows, or sometimes I even do a brown. If I already have that in my set, I'll use brown instead of doing a special icing that goes underneath this gold. So you can use what you want, but I have found that if you use a color that kind of complements your gold coverage will look so much better because you don't have a white icing trying to peek out from underneath. You have a color that complements your gold, and it's a lot easier to cover it because if there is a tiny bit peeking through, it's way less noticeable. So that is what I usually do, and I highly recommend that you do that as well. Now, the gold I'm using here is from Truly Mad Plastic, or TMP, and it is their super gold. Now, this is my favorite gold. It's actually the only gold that I have used for the past 4 years because I love it so much. The coverage is excellent, and I just don't feel like you can beat this gold color. It looks fantastic. So you are going to mix this gold luster dust, whatever gold luster dust you choose, but this one is linked in the description box below. You're going to want to mix that with a high proof alcohol. The one that I use is a clear alcohol that is about 90 proof. So you want to make sure that it has a really high alcohol content and that it's clear. You don't want any color with it at all. And then you want to mix your luster dust with the alcohol until it's a nice paste. If it's too thin, it'll run off of your cookie and you can't control it. So as you can see, my luster dust is staying exactly where I painted. So just mix it until it's a nice paste, not too thin. And then using a paintbrush that you use for edible decorations only, you can paint on your luster dust onto your cookie. And I know some people worry that you're using alcohol on your cookie, but the alcohol is such a high proof of alcohol that it evaporates so quickly and it leaves behind zero, and I mean zero taste. Okay, I got lucky and I didn't have to go back and add a second layer of gold to this cookie, but you might have to do some touch-ups if you missed some areas. And then I'm just finishing off this ring cookie with the birthday boy's name. This is optional. You don't have to do that. I was just looking for somewhere to put his name, so I decided to put it on the golden ring. And that's it. Our Zach golden ring cookie is done. Let's move on to the next design, which is the Tails character. Now, while Tails only had a small part in the very first movie, he actually plays a large part in the second movie. So you are definitely going to want to include him if you can in any Sonic themed birthday sets that you do. He truly is one of the most fun and lovable characters in the Sonic franchise. So I feel like this cookie cutter and this cookie kind of represent that fun side of our sweet little Tails. So I'm starting out by doing some of the areas on our Tails character that are not connected, because you can do multiple areas of a character cookie at one time as long as they are not touching, because you need each section to dry individually. Now, with my projector on, I did go ahead and outline the ears and the mouth and a few other sections, but really what the first thing I'm going to do is my character's eyes. So I went ahead and I put down the green, and I will be going back in just a second to do the black part of his pupil with that wet on wet technique. So I really hate working with my projector on. It drives me bonkers. So I try to do as much as I can without my projector on. So this way I was able to outline some various sections so that I can turn off my projector and then fill in those with the flood. But again, the first place I'm going to work is the eyes. So after you put down your black on the eyes, do a little white dot to kind of again help with that cartoony sparkle in its eye, and then go back and fill in the places on your cookie that you have outlined with some flood icing, making sure that you don't let any of your flood areas touch one another. They really need to stay separate. So I'm doing a couple of his whisker areas on his face. I'm not sure what you call that part of a fox's face, but we're going to go with some like whisker type hair areas. And then I'm also going to do the gray part of his ears as well as the tan part on his mouth. I always feel like when cookiers think about doing character work, it's intimidating because characters are pretty intense. It's not like it's up for interpretation. It either looks like the character or it doesn't, and you want your clients to be happy. Even if it's your own child that you're making this for, you want them to be happy, and you want them to look at the cookie and say, oh, this is definitely a fill in the blank. So it is intimidating. However, I hope that what you're learning with this video between me doing Sonic and now Tails and in a few minutes doing the Knuckles cookie is that you see that characters don't have to be so scary as long as you break them down. Look at the character, try to see it in different parts and just work on one section at a time and build it up. And I promise you, if you do that, it really will come together. Take your time. Now, I'm not going to lie to you, characters do take time more than anything else. That is my biggest hardship when it comes to characters. Not only do you want it to look like the actual character, and it also just takes a lot of time to make that happen because you do have to do all of these steps individually. That just takes a lot of time and a lot of time, extra colors and just all of the extra work that is involved with them. That is true. That is the case. It does take extra time. So make sure that you're including that and factoring that in when you are pricing character work out for customers if you're charging them. However, I do have to encourage you to just try to do character work if you haven't before. I realize that for a lot of people, sometimes they don't want to do any copyrighted characters, and I totally understand that as well. So if that is your motivation for not doing them, 100% I stand in your corner. However, if you want to do them and just haven't done them because you're scared of how much work it is, I hope that you're learning from my videos that it really isn't so horrible as long as you take it step by step and just go slow and build up that character with icing as you work. Okay, I've now moved on to a second layer on this cookie. So I added white to Tails' ears. I added white around his eyes, and then I finished off the whisker type fur on the side of his face. And again, don't forget, you are going to want to make sure you get out any air bubbles. I definitely have seen a little bit of divots, a little bit of not full cracking, but I do see occasionally some dents in my icing. So just make sure you're getting out those air bubbles to help prevent that from happening. This was a very humid day when I made these cookies. So sometimes, no matter how much prep work you do, how perfect your icing is, when the weather is bad, you are going to have some dents in your cookies. Like look at Tails' ears right here, the gray part. Do you see those dents? So even though that icing was a good consistency, even though I tried to get out all the air bubbles I could, I'm still having some indentation in my icing, and that is just because it was a really humid day, and my icing struggles here in Arkansas on really humid days. So even though you do everything you can, sometimes you still don't win. So just be encouraged to try your best. Sometimes it's still going to happen, but you just got to keep moving on, and your cookies are still going to look great anyway. Now that we are finished with the white part of Tails' face, I wanted to take the time to mention here why I separated out that fur. Because again, if I would have done an entire section of white on the bottom, where I would have done right under his eyes and around his mouth, as well as the whisker type fur that comes out on the side of his face, I would have lost a lot of that detail that makes Tails. So that is why I took the extra time to do the fur, the whisker part of his fur separate from his face. And do you see the payoff? It really makes it worth it in the end. So even though it's really tempting to do just one whole section of white to get it done quickly, when you separate it out, those extra details make all the difference in the world. Now that we're to the orangey type color of Tails' fur, we actually are going to flood this entire section at one time. Now we are going to add a second layer of fur on top, and you'll see that happen in just a minute. So that will add some dimension and detail to the top part of Tails' head. However, for right now, we are going to flood this entire top portion, and you're really going to start seeing the Tails character come to life once we have the entire cookie flooded. And I do want to recommend that you go really carefully around the outer portion of his ears. There's not a lot of room there for icing, so you want to make sure that you go really slowly and don't put too much pressure on your icing bag, because otherwise your icing can just spill right over that edge. So that's just my little note from experience, because I've done that too many times to count. Just make sure you go slow and you don't put very much pressure on your bag at all. In fact, I generally, whenever whenever I'm going on in a really tight place like that, I pretty much just let the icing fall out of the bag as I'm moving it instead of putting any pressure down on my bag. Okay, now that our entire base of our cookie has dried, let's add a few little hairs coming out of Tails' face right by his ear. This is a signature part of Tails' look, so you definitely don't want to skip this part. So I'm outlining the 3 sections of hair that I have coming out from his ear, and I'm also piping in with the same icing. So you can see this is pretty thick icing. I did not want this section to crater at all, so I'm going to have to use my scribe tool and really shake my icing back and forth to smooth it out. Otherwise it will stay clunky, and I don't want it to stay clunky. I want it to be able to be smooth, but I still wanted it to be thick enough that I didn't have to worry about cratering. So there's a fine line there, but I think you can tell here as I move my scribe tool back and forth, it is smoothing out. So it worked out in my favor that it wasn't too thick of icing, but definitely not too thin. All right, we only have one thing left to do on our Tails cookie, and that is to give him a little nose. So with your medium consistency black icing, you're gonna do an upside down triangle right in between his eyes on the white part of his face. Fill it in, and then with your thick white icing, just give him a little spot on his nose, just like you did with Sonic, to help with that cartoony look. And that's it. Our cute little Tails character cookie is done. Let's move on to the Zone 5 cookie. Now for this design, I wanted it to look like the background of the video game. So that's why I broke it up into a green grass area with a blue sky and then a checkered brown bottom, which all resembles the game. And also in the game, you don't go from level 1 to level 2 when you pass a level. You actually go from zone 1 to zone 2 and so forth. So that's why this cookie on top of our background will say zone 5, because Zach is turning 5, and instead of saying level 5, it's actually zone in the game. So if you're confused on why that was this design, that's what it's all about. This is not a nod to the movie as much as it is a nod to the video games. And finally, this is a circle cookie cutter that I use, but it's not just any circle cookie cutter. It is actually the inside of the ring cookie that I cut out. So if you go back a couple of designs, I told you that I used a larger circle cookie cutter, and then I used a smaller circle cookie cutter to take out the inside of the ring. Well, instead of just putting that dough aside and remixing it back into my other dough, I decided I would just keep out that dough and use it as its own design, which is what this is, the Zone 5. So you can do a bigger circle for this design. I just felt like I was doing so much character work that I thought, and using so much icing with that, and it took me so much time, I thought it was okay if this cookie was on the smaller side to save myself a little bit of time, use up the dough that I was already taking out of another cookie, and make this a part of the design instead of not using that cookie dough at all. So the first thing I did was I took the middle section and I went ahead and did that in the green, let it dry, did the brown and the blue next to the green. Let that dry completely because I'm doing marker work on top of it. So this is not a time that you want to just let your icing crisp over. It really needs to be fairly dry before you start putting any marker on top of it, because if it's too wet, your marker will punch through your icing. So definitely let this sit under a fan for a while before you do these next steps. But I did green lines for the grass with a green edible marker. Again, this will all be linked down in the description box below. Then I made some checkered boxes with my brown edible marker on the brown portion of this cookie to mirror somewhat the game without having to have an airbrush machine. Now I am going to let this dry for just a minute or two before I put my white icing on top, before I do the Zone 5, just so that that edible marker ink doesn't accidentally bleed into that white icing that I'm putting on top here. I'm using the Fonto app to make my fonts. So I write out Zone 5 in the Fonto app, and then I use the Camera Lucida app to project the image that I made onto my cookie. So I will have a whole video that I do about what apps I use, but just so you know, those are the two apps I use: Fonto to make my text, and then Camera Lucida to project it onto my cookie. And there we go, our Zone 5 cookie is complete, and we have one final design, and that's our Knuckles cookie. Now I'm going to be honest with you, this particular cookie cutter is no longer available. So I did find one from JB Cutters that I'm going to link in the description box below, but please know that it's not this exact cookie cutter. I tried to find one as similar as I could. With Knuckles, he's just now in this new movie. He wasn't at all even referenced in the first movie. So I think that you will start seeing more Knuckles cookie cutters coming out. I just personally didn't see a whole lot yet, and the one I used for here isn't available anymore. So just keep an eye out. Again, I'll link one in the description box below, but you may find a better one, a better option for yourself just by doing a search whenever you need it. So just a heads up there. So all three of our characters actually have different colored eyes. Tails has green eyes, Knuckles has kind of a turquoise teal eye, and Knuckles has a purple eye. So we're going to do that first, and because of the way his head is positioned, Knuckles actually has the smallest of the eyes in these cookie cutters. So you're going to have to just put a tiny bit of colored purple color down. You'll do the black pupil with the white dot on the eye, just like we did with both of our other characters, that consistency between all the characters. Then you are going to finish off his eye with the whites of the eye. I also did the white of his mouth. That's where his teeth are going to go. And then now here you see me doing the tan part of his mouth as well. And as always, I'm letting each section dry before I move on to the next. So sometimes it's kind of hard to tell if it's dry or not, but I am drying every section before I move on to the next. And really and truly, when you're talking about these smaller sections, usually I'm able to kind of move through all of my characters. So however many cookies, this was a very large order. So I had probably 6 of each character. So by the time that I do 6 sets of eyes or 6 teeth or 6 mouths, whatever it is, by the time that I put those under a fan and I get back to the first one, it's dried enough for me to be able to move on to the next section. So I'm not talking about waiting hours in between these steps. A lot of times you are ready to go by the time that you get back to the cookie again. So you really only have to wait until the icing has crisped over to prevent your icing from blending into each other. You most definitely don't have to wait hours in between every step. All right, so Knuckles is a little bit of a mischievous character, so that is why we kind of see him with a smirk and a side glance. So his brows are furrowed just a tiny bit in this particular image, this cookie cutter. So that is why I kind of did a divot in his eye right there. And then I went to his hair portion. Again, it's kind of like the other characters. I'm not really sure what you call this part of him. But his hair, I'm doing 2 at a time and letting those dry, and then I'll come back and do the 2 others, and then we will do the top of his head at the very end. Now, Knuckles is a red color, which truthfully a lot of cookiers struggle with getting reds red because it does take a significant amount of food coloring, food gel color to get a good, deep, nice red. And because I freeze all of my leftover icing, I never ever start my red color with actual white icing. I always start with a red. When I need a red, I always start with a pink base or an existing red that I have left over. So once you have some icing built up, again, I freeze all of my icing. It all goes into the freezer as soon as I'm done with it. Because of the amount of sugar in your icing, it keeps it stable in the freezer, and it's really great. You can freeze your icing. Don't throw away your icing. I threw away so much icing at the beginning of my cookier career that I wish I could so badly tell myself not to do. So don't throw away your icing, freeze it. But when I need a red, if I don't have any red or I have just a little bit of red, I'll look and see if I have any pinks at all. If I have a pink or even a peach color, anything, I will start with that first, and then I will add red dye to it. Now, my favorite red dye is actually, I combine 2 reds from Hobby Lobby. We have a Hobby Lobby very close to us, and I am the world's worst about ordering things in advance before I need them. So even though Americolor is great and there's a lot of other dye options out there now, I tend to use Hobby Lobby just for the convenience of it being here in my city. So the 2 Hobby Lobby colors that I use for for a red like this is the super red and red red. And I actually really prefer the super red the most. That probably has the most concentrated bright red, whereas the red red is a little bit of a deeper red. But I combine the two until I end up with a red like this. Now, because I started with a pink base or leftover red icing that I added fresh white icing too, I am still going to need to add dye, but it is a significantly less amount when you already have a colored base. If you're starting from white, you will be dumping so much dye in that icing until you get to red. But when you start with a pink base or an existing red that you've added white to, oh my goodness, it makes such a difference in the world. You don't have to put hardly any dye in it to get this deep red. All right, so we did add an eyebrow to our knuckles. We added a nose with a white dot on the end, and then I did a little bit of a squiggly line on the white section of his mouth where his teeth are, and that's it. Our Knuckles character is done. Now, I've actually done the Sonic themed birthday set quite a bit, so I thought I would show you some of the variations that I have made over the last few years. This set, I didn't do the zone cookie on its own. I actually just did Copeland Zone 7 on the golden ring, so that's one option. You don't have to do the additional circle. This set did not have Knuckles at all, and instead of writing the birthday boy's name on the golden ring, I did everything on the smaller circle. So I did Champ, which was his name, and then Zone 4 for his 4th birthday. And again, there's no Knuckles on these cookies at all. This, I didn't do the golden ring or the zone cookie. Instead, I just did happy birthday cookies with the 3 character colors. So I did a red, the tails kind of orangey color, and the blue for Sonic. So that's an option as well. You don't have to even do the golden ring if you don't want to mess with that. And then again, finally, this was the set that you just saw me decorate. So I wanted to put that on here as a reminder of this other design that I did that you just watched me decorate. So thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you feel confident to make your own Sonic themed set now that you've watched this video. And if you have any questions at all, please don't hesitate to ask, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.